On to language, thought and communication. Alright, so let's start with Piaget's theory. Remember, he thinks that language depends on thought. Okay, so they already know a child already knows things, and then they learn the words that fit with the things that they already know about. Okay, so this is in the idea of going through into the pre-operational stage. You get rapid progress of language as it's coming through. And of course, logical thinking doesn't come until the concrete operational stage, as we looked at before. So evaluation-wise, Piaget's theory is not random. And a weakness to his argument is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which comes next. And then another weakness is that schemas can't be scientifically measured. All right, so let's then look at the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Okay, so remember, this is the other way round, that they think that thinking depends on language. Okay, they have a strong version and a weak version. Okay, where in your strong version, language determines what you are thinking about. And it's this idea that you can only think about things that you have words to be able to describe what you are thinking. So we can see this, that there are particular languages which have no words for certain objects and certain thoughts, and that's where that comes from. The weak version talks about the idea that people will think about things in a different way because of the language that they have to describe it. So, for example, the big example that is always used is the idea of the Inuit having so many words for the word snow because it is so important to them. Interesting if they looked at the Japanese way of forming words by putting concepts together. All right, so we have to evaluate this. There are two very negative points to this. One is that the differences are exaggerated. Right, so the evidence really doesn't support the idea that much. And obviously the other negative is that you've got Piaget's theory, which is saying that thoughts come before language. However, there is a positive to this, that it does put a link between language and intelligence, right? So those people that have a wider vocabulary have got a more elaborated code of talking and way of talking, right? And this also means that you can see this because you can think more deeply, then you develop the language so that you are actually able to explain the thoughts that you are having. Next thing is continuing on this idea about language and thought. Okay, so our cultures will change the way that we look at things and recall things. So if you look at the Hopi language, then he calls it, Whorf was the one who was researching it, and he called it a timeless language. And this is because they don't have any difference between past, present and future. All they do is use the word time when they're talking about events, right? So here's this idea that we put times on things because culturally it's very important to us. But we also know, living in this country, that people are often not on time, and they see that as perfectly okay to waste your time. Language can also affect our recall of events. So we might have seen something, but we haven't got the language to be able to describe what we've seen. So here again, this is this idea that we have a thought and then we develop the language to fit with it. So if I'm trying to describe something to you, Right, I'm looking at something in my apartment right now, yeah? So it's orange and it's got knobbly bits on it, and it's a cylinder which has the orange kind of foamy material wrapped around it. Anybody know what I'm talking about? I'm not sure that I know what that's called now. But anyway, my son made me get one so that I can roll out my muscle joint. Oh, he calls it a foam roller. So that I can roll out my muscles and make sure that I don't get cramps and things. Okay, then if we go on to look at the Zuni. Okay, so the Zunis only have one word for shades of yellow and orange, and they don't use lots of different words to describe colours. Okay, so this can then have a big effect on the way that we recall things around us, right? So therefore, how are we communicating everything? So we then go on to look at human and animal communication to compare between them. Now we go on to a named study. This is von Frisch's bee study. So remember that von Frisch wanted to describe the dances performed by bees and explain what communication was going on and what information was being passed on by them. All right, so remember, he was a big old scientist, so he did this study over many years. He made over 6,000 observations of honeybees over a 20-year period, and he'd watched them going about their daily business. All right, so he found that there were two different dances that the bees were doing. The round dance meant that food that was less than 100 meters away, and the waggle dance, which meant that the bee was moving in a figure of 8. And in the straight section, the bee does a little waggle of its abdomen, and the direction of that line is indicating the direction of the pollen to bees that are watching this dance. So his conclusion was that bees have a very sophisticated form of communication. It's very accurate, and it also has an evolutionary value because it's what helps them to survive, because they're passing messages on. Okay, so obviously the big positive of this is that it has a lot of scientific value and it's made important contributions to the work of scientific research. However, a big negative is that he doesn't take into account sounds that are made. He overlooks those completely. And the other one was that bees don't always respond to the waggle dance. Right, so then we moved on to look at the functions of animal communication. Okay, so we talked about survival, reproduction, territory, and food. Okay, so there might be sounds that are done to warn people. There might be special ruffling of feathers to attract a male or a female for reproduction. There might be scent marking to mark out a territory and claim it for yourself. And then, as with the bees, you are pointing to a food source or to the pollen. So you'll find there are lots of ways of communicating that to people. All right, there are some differences in human communication and animal communication. Right, humans will plan ahead. We talk about things in the future. It doesn't appear that animals are necessarily, making a date to meet their friend down the coffee shop in a week's time. We also have quite restricted communication as far as we understand it between animals. So creativity doesn't appear to be there, but we might just be misinterpreting that. And then we can use a whole range of different ways of expressing ourselves. So in the book it calls it having multiple channels, whereas the animals only appear to have one single channel that they use to communicate with each other. All right, I am moving on. So we then went on to non-verbal communication. So we went on to my favourite thing that I do with you, which is eye contact. where you all start looking at me when I'm talking about this, right? So non-verbal communication is looking at facial expressions, body language, sounds that convey a meaning. All right, so with eye contact, it can regulate the flow of conversation because we're looking at each other and we're seeing, oh, that's my turn to talk, or they're looking at me to say something. Obviously, eye contact can be signaling attraction. Remember, if you look someone in the eyes, they're going to trust you more. They're going to think that you are looking deep into their soul. But again, as I told you, look at their nose and they'll think you're looking at their eyes. And also for expressing emotion, right? So your eyes are described as the window to your soul, so people can see if you're actually, when you smile, if you really mean it. Okay, so evaluatory wise, this is positive because it has a real world application. However, eye contact studies do use rating scales, and they can be, people will judge things in different ways when they're rating things. And again, this is a bit of an artificial study when we're looking at it. All right, then on to body language. So we talked about open and closed posture, Peter Pan pose, where you look very positive and you're open to people speaking to you. Closed posture, where you're crossing your arms and shutting yourself off, so becoming very defensive in the way that you are standing. All right, we talked about postural echoes. So if you're in an interview, copy what the person is doing with you. So this is called mirroring as well. And so it's this idea that you are saying, yep, what you're doing is I feel comfortable with, so I will do it too. And then the person will feel more comfortable with you because they think you're a similar person to them. We can also use touch as a way of body language, right? So you might remember the Friends episode where they all keep touching each other's bottoms, but remember there's the dinner lady study where, the dinner lady touches people's hands as she hands them change and things, and people quite like it. They feel comforted by it, like she actually cares about them. I think I might find her a bit creepy. Okay, so evaluation of body language, obviously, again, positively, it's got a real world application. However, they do lack control. Extraneous variables aren't really considered or controlled in any way, and they are a bit unethical. All this thing of touching people, not necessarily the right thing to do. Okay, next thing in that is personal space. So what is your personal space? And this is different between culture, gender, and your status, right? So in certain cultures, it's perfectly okay to stand really close to people. Arab people will do that a lot more when they're in conversation, whereas English people like a nice little space between them, which obviously proves to be very positive when there are viruses flying around. Okay, gender differences. Men generally prefer a larger social distance when they're interacting with other men than women do when they're interacting with other women. And men like to sit face to face with each other, whereas females tend to sit beside each other so that they can talk, and women feel more uncomfortable with having their personal space taken over. Status difference. If you feel you are a peer with somebody, or an equal with somebody, you will stand closer to them. You put a distance between you if you feel there is a hierarchical state going on. Okay, so again, a positive of this is a real world application. However, there are two negatives. It is very oversimplistic in what it is talking about. Because we talked about toilets and personal space and where do you stand and whatever else. Why did two girls go into a cubicle together? That sort of stuff. It's also quite an unrepresentative sample when they're looking at different groups of people. Okay, we also then went on to look at Darwin's evolutionary theory, which is still to do with nonverbal behaviour. Okay, so this idea that survival, going back to ways of communicating and what they're for, that survival of the fittest is down to this. So your nonverbal communication has evolved so that you can give off certain signs. So the biggest one where it's become adaptive is this idea that we can express emotions, we can show that we are ready to attack, we can show that we are strong, we can show all sorts of different things. Right now, you can compare that with human behaviour. We see it, right? We see people who will go into a defensive mode, people who will kind of bare their teeth at people to get their idea across, right? Then we looked at serviceable habits. So things like wrinkling your nose, baring your teeth are serviceable habits. So they're adaptive, they've come from our ancestors, they promote survival, and they have a purpose. Right, and it's the same as an animal would use. Okay, so a strength of this is that it supports other research into facial expressions. And there's research looking at newborn babies as well. However, he doesn't take into account cultural differences in nonverbal communication. Darwin also looked at things that certainly seem to be innate in the way that people do things. Okay, so then that goes into this whole idea of, are things innate or are they learned? So Neonate Research, looking at newborn babies, they certainly seem to be imitating what they are seeing around them, but at a later stage. But when they are very young, they are still, showing certain expressions. They know how to cry. It would appear that some of them sort of smile a little bit, that sort of thing, yeah? So they're born with what are called social releases. Okay, so looking at people, smiling at people, they will do because it helps them to get noticed. And you will see facial expressions. Okay, if you make a baby jump, it will, it will cry, it will do all the facial expressions. Okay, if you have a sensory deprived child, then they won't be doing all of those things. So Jane Thompson looked at blind children, and even blind children knew how to smile, even though they'd never seen it, right? So this shouldn't be happening if it's learnt. So that would point to the fact that it is innate, yeah. However, if you look at contact versus non-contact cultures, we will see, particularly when you've got like feral children, you will see that they haven't learnt certain things that other people have who are living with a family. Things like gestures. These are things that people learn from other people. It's certainly not innate. And it would also explain cultural differences, right? So that then takes us on to Yuki's study of emoticons, another named study in our set of case studies. Okay, so remember what he was doing was that he wanted to see whether Japanese people focus on people's eyes to judge their emotions, in contrast to American people, where he thinks they're more likely to focus on the mouth. So he uses a cross-cultural study, 95 students from Japan and 118 from America, and he puts them into independent group designs. They're then shown a group of emoticons and they're asked to say which ones are happy and which ones are sad, and they rate them on a scale from 1 to 10. Of course, the results are that the Japanese gave higher ratings to faces with happy eyes. The Americans give higher ratings with happy mouths. And so this suggests that we interpret facial expressions in a different way. So Japanese people look to the eyes, but the mouth can be looking sad. American people look to the mouth and the eyes can be looking sad, right? Okay, so evaluation of this, all negatives. One weakness is that emoticons don't actually represent human faces. Why didn't you use them? He only tested one emotion. There could be lots of others that could be including. And obviously using rating scales is always going to be very subjective for people. And that's it.